Normandy, July 1944. A German paratrooper has been lying inside the base of a hedgerow since before dawn. Not behind it, inside it. His helmet is netted with leaves. His face is blackened with soot. His smock is printed in broken greens and browns, the kind of pattern designed to disappear under trees, in wet grass, along a sunken lane where the light never lands cleanly. For 6 hours he does not cough. He does not scratch. He does not shift his weight. Because in German camouflage training, stillness is not a detail. Stillness is the weapon. No American scout sees him. No rifleman points. No officer raises binoculars and says, "There." Then the hedge erupts. A Sherman tank, rolling along the lane, fires into the vegetation before anyone in the column has confirmed a target. A mortar section behind it drops rounds on the same stretch of earth. One shell bursts above the bank, then another. The paratrooper dies exactly where he was trained to survive. And the thing that makes his death strange is this. His camouflage worked. The Americans did not find the man. They found the piece of ground that probably contained him. That difference is the entire story. Because 6 weeks earlier, the same German concealment system had been wrecking British and Canadian infantry east of Caen. In the Bocage, German riflemen and observers seemed to vanish between fields. British patrols advanced into hedgerows, took fire from places they could not identify, went to ground, and waited under mortars that had already been sighted onto them. By the end of August, British, Canadian, and Polish forces had suffered roughly 83,000 casualties in Normandy, with 16,000 dead. A large share of that loss came from weapons directed by men the attackers never saw. So the question is not whether German camouflage was good. It was. The question is why it was deadly against one Allied army, then suddenly less magical against another. The answer is not sharper American eyes. It is not better American camouflage. It is not some simple story about courage. It is a colder answer. The United States Army had built a way of fighting in which seeing the enemy was useful, but not always necessary. To understand why that mattered, you have to take the German cloth seriously. In 1931, the German Army introduced Splittertarn, a splinter camouflage pattern of angular greens and browns printed over a dull field, with thin dash marks that looked like falling rain. It began as shelter cloth, not as a full combat uniform, but the logic was obvious. A soldier wrapped in the same pattern as his equipment was harder to separate from broken vegetation. It was good, but it was not the breakthrough. The breakthrough came from the SS Camouflage Office in the middle 1930s, when Major Wim Brandt brought in Johann Georg Otto Schick, a Munich art professor who understood pattern not as military paint, but as visual deception. Schick was not thinking in blocks and polygons. He was thinking in light, tree shade, leaf edges, the way a human eye catches a clean outline before it understands a face, the way repeated shapes give the brain something to lock onto. So his patterns removed the thing the eye wanted most, a stable edge, oak leaf, plane tree, blurred edge, smoke pattern. They were not just decorative fields of green and brown. They were attempts to imitate the broken light under foliage. Many were reversible, greener for summer, browner for autumn, giving one garment 2 seasonal lives. Field trials in 1937 suggested a measurable casualty reduction. German elite formations took the lesson seriously. By the time the war reached Normandy, German paratroopers, Waffen-SS units, and other formations had access to the most advanced soldier camouflage system any major army had put into mass use. And Normandy was built to reward it. The Bocage was not open country. It was a maze. Small fields, often no more than a few dozen yards across, were divided by old earthen banks. On top of those banks grew hawthorn, bramble, roots, trees, and thick summer growth. Lanes ran sunken between them, so a man could stand 10 yards away and be invisible. A German defender could cut a firing slit into the bank, back into the root mass, cover the opening with leaves, and wait. He did not need to defeat the Allied army in a clean rifle duel. He only needed to see first. A forward observer, hidden in one hedgerow, could watch a British section enter the field, pass coordinates to mortar crews several thousand yards behind the front, and disappear before anyone understood what had happened. That was the system. The camouflage did not have to kill directly. It had to let the observer live long enough to call the killing fire. Against British doctrine, this was almost perfect. British infantry doctrine in 1944 was disciplined, methodical, and built from hard experience. In the desert in North Africa, a careful attack could be organized around a known objective. Reconnaissance found the position. Artillery battered it. Infantry advanced under a timed barrage. Tanks and supporting weapons moved in a sequence that made sense on ground where you could see. The problem was that the Bocage took away the first step. It took away the target. A British platoon could enter a field and know, almost with certainty, that Germans were somewhere behind the next wall of green. But somewhere was not enough for a doctrine that still expected a visible or positively identified point of resistance. That forced a brutal rhythm. Move, get hit, stop, call for support, wait. And the moment the infantry stopped, German mortars had what they wanted. Men fixed in place. This was why veterans remembered the strange panic of seeing one German appear for half a second. Everyone fired. Everyone. Not because one soldier mattered that much, but because visible Germans had become rare events. Most of the killing came from positions nobody could point to. The same logic scaled up to armor. At Villers-Bocage in June 1944, the British 7th Armored Division, veterans of mobile desert war, pushed a column through narrow Norman roads. A concealed Tiger tank under Michael Whitman struck from a position the column had not detected in time. British vehicles were trapped in a street, too close, too confined, too late to deploy properly. The popular version of that story turns it into a duel between a famous tank commander and an unlucky British column. But the deeper lesson is simpler. The road did not reveal the threat until the threat had already fired. That was the Bocage. That was the German advantage. And it came from one shared assumption running through both sides of the British-German fight. Before you could kill a man, you had to find him. The Americans entered that terrain with a different habit. Not always a better habit. Sometimes it was wasteful. Sometimes it was frighteningly blunt. Sometimes it tore apart empty brush. But it was different in exactly the way the German system was least prepared for. The American army had spent the years between the wars staring at a lesson many armies had noticed and then failed to reorganize around. In modern combat, most enemies are not visible. They are behind earth, smoke, timber, walls, ridges, hedges, or darkness. Waiting for a perfect target wastes the advantage of firepower. So American doctrine moved toward a practical question. If the enemy is probably there, what can you do before he shows himself? One answer was the M1 Garand. Adopted in 1936, it gave the American rifleman a semi-automatic weapon when most major armies still issued bolt-action rifles. That mattered less because of any single heroic shot, and more because of what a squad could afford to do. A British Lee Enfield was fast for a bolt-action rifle. A German Karabiner 98K was accurate and familiar, but an American squad with Garands and a Browning automatic rifle could put a far heavier volume of aimed or area fire into a suspect hedge while still moving. That changed the moral math of a hedgerow. A British section often needed to identify where fire was coming from before it could spend its limited small arms fire intelligently. An American squad could fire into the hedge because the hedge looked guilty. That was reconnaissance by fire, not a slogan, a procedure. Fire into likely cover. Watch for return fire. Watch for movement. Watch for leaves shaking in the wrong place. Force the hidden man to reveal himself or kill him before he has the chance. Tanks did the same thing. Shermans approached hedgerows with machine guns already combing the vegetation. Columns fired left and right into banks, orchards, wall lines, and suspicious corners. Truck gunners used .50 caliber Brownings not as decoration, but as insurance against the unseen. From inside a German position, this must have felt almost irrational. The American did not behave like a man searching for a concealed opponent. He behaved like a man punishing the landscape. And then the artillery arrived. The deeper American advantage was not the Garand by itself. It was the network behind the riflemen. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, long before the war, American artillery officers had developed a fire direction system that let multiple batteries calculate and deliver fire onto a single target quickly. The idea was not glamorous. It was tables, radios, maps, survey, discipline, and mathematics. But in Normandy, it became one of the most terrifying things a hidden infantryman could face. A forward observer did not need to see a helmet. He needed a grid. A lieutenant did not need to know exactly which shrub held the machine gun. He needed to identify the field, the bank, the orchard corner, the road bend, the suspected position. Within minutes, American guns could bring shells from several batteries onto that patch of earth. The enemy might be there. He might not. But if he was there, the distinction between visible and invisible narrowed very quickly. This is why German prisoners kept describing a kind of impossible experience. They were not saying the Americans had seen them. They were saying the Americans had hit them anyway. At Hill 192 near St. Lo, the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division fought German paratroopers in terrain that should have favored concealment. The defenders were experienced. The hedgerows were thick. The positions were well chosen. But American artillery did not have to admire the camouflage. Night after night, time-on-target missions struck the same narrow sector. Shells arrived in sudden, coordinated bursts, denying the defenders the normal soldier's instinct for pattern. When to move, when to lift your head, when to crawl back into the firing slit. The ground itself became untrustworthy. That is the point. A camouflage smock hides a body. It does not hide a map square. The German system was excellent at defeating human sight. The American system kept asking a different question. Not where is the man, but where does the man have to be? A machine gun cannot cover this lane unless it is somewhere along that bank. A mortar observer cannot see this field unless he is in that tree line. A rifleman cannot fire through this gap unless he is behind that clump of roots. So the Americans fired at the answer. Then came the winter weapon that made the logic even harsher. For most of the war, The proximity fuse, or VT fuse, had been guarded for anti-aircraft use. It was one of the most difficult electronic weapons the Allies produced, a miniature radio device inside an artillery shell that had to survive the violence of being fired from a cannon, then detonate when it sensed the ground beneath it. For ground troops, its effect was devastating. Traditional artillery killed from the ground outward. A shell hit earth, and fragments sprayed out and up. A man hugging the soil, lying in a shallow scrape, or tucked under brush, could sometimes survive because the metal passed over him. The VT fuse changed the angle of death. The shell exploded in the air. Fragments came down. A foxhole was less safe. A prone body was less safe. Brush was not enough. A shallow position in a forest was not enough. In the Ardennes and the Hurtgen forest, American artillery using proximity fuses punished German infantry in snow, trees, and broken ground with a violence that many soldiers had never experienced before. And again, the central fact remained the same. The shell did not need a visible man. It needed an area where men were likely to be. By late 1944, the German soldier in camouflage was confronting a layered American method. The squad fired into likely cover. The tank combed hedges before crossing them. The forward observer called batteries onto suspected coordinates. Time on target made many shells arrive almost together. The proximity fuse made air above the position dangerous. No single piece made camouflage useless. Together, they made individual invisibility less decisive. This is why the usual story misses the point when it treats the Americans as simply more aggressive, or the Germans as suddenly less skilled. The German rifleman had not forgotten how to hide. He was still hard to see. His training was still sound inside the world it had been designed for. If another infantryman had to spot him, identify him, aim at him, and shoot him, his odds improved dramatically. Against British and Canadian units fighting a careful, visible target battle, that advantage could be murderous. But the American method changed the unit of attention. The British soldier often searched for a firing point. The American system attacked a probable zone. The German camouflage was designed to break the outline of a man. The American artillery grid had no interest in outlines. That is not a romantic lesson. It is an institutional one. The U.S. Army did not stumble into this because every platoon leader was a genius. It came from unglamorous investments made years earlier when the Army was small, poorly funded, and easy to ignore. A semi-automatic rifle that traditionalists thought would waste ammunition. A fire direction system many officers thought was too technical. A radio-based shell fuse that looked almost impossible to make reliable. A doctrine that accepted uncertainty instead of pretending it could be eliminated. The Germans had brilliant small unit leaders. They had disciplined camouflage practice. They had excellent artillery within its own framework. They had soldiers who could use terrain with a skill their enemies often admitted. What they did not have at the same level of integration was a system that let an ordinary forward observer turn suspicion into concentrated violence within minutes. That gap mattered more than cloth. Otto Schick's patterns did not fail as camouflage. After the war, ideas similar to his would shape camouflage development for decades. Broken edges, seasonal coloration, disruptive spots, dappled light, those principles were real. They remain real. Against eyes, the cloth was brilliant. Against coordinates, it was only cloth. So return to the man in the hedge. The paratrooper is still. The pattern is good. The leaves around him do not move. His outline is gone. By the rules he learned, he has done everything necessary to remain alive. But down the lane, an American crew is not asking whether it can see him. It is asking whether that hedge is a place a German would use. The answer is yes, so the hedge is fired on. That is the terrible arithmetic of Normandy. The Germans had solved the problem of being seen. The Americans had built a battlefield where the more important problem was being somewhere fire could reach. The cloth hid the soldier. It could not hide the square.